Thank you for joining us on the History of Astrology class. My name is Darrell Whitaker and I will be your presenter for today. It is 8 o'clock on the 16th of August and I'm recording in London, England. So let's get started with the History of Astrology class. So what will we be going through today? Firstly, we're going to touch on who I am so you can get a better understanding of who I am and what I do. Then we will go through all of the different eras in astrology through the ancient era up until the modern era. So we'll be covering about 3,500 years of history, but no need to worry. I'm not going to try to overload you with information. Try to keep everything that is practical and best for you in the presentation. So let's get started. So who am I? I am a spiritual life coach and astrologer. I've been studying astrology for almost 12 years now, and also studying all manners of spirituality and religion from as far back as when I was 11 years old. So it's about 20 years. It is my goal to help spiritually aware millennials to get a better understanding of how to work with themselves and the universal powers so that they are able to get a grasp of this life. Although we have to work, it's important that we combined both the spiritual and the practical. I'm also a self-published author, public speaker, content creator. I wear many different hats, but the most important thing for me is just ensuring that everybody is blessed and their vibration is elevated with everything that I do. So we're just going to talk a little bit on the astrological premise, which was discovered in ancient Mesopotamia, and it's dating back to about 1500 BCE. And it says, the sky and earth together produce omens, each separate, not divided. The sky and earth are interconnected. A sign which is bad in the sky is also bad on earth. A sign which is bad on earth is also bad in the sky. So I just want to talk a little bit about what it's actually saying there, because it comes from an ancient Hermetic principle, which is the law of mentalism. You've got the law of correspondence, you've got the law of vibration, you've got the law of gender, you've also got the law of polarity as well. Now, these laws were developed by Hermes Trismegistus, and I have to say that is allegedly, because Hermes Trismegistus is said to be the Egyptian god Thoth. Hermes is the Greek translation of that, and Trismegistus actually means 3 times great. So Trismegistus is a phrase used if you was to say the great, great, great Hermes, for example, the thrice great. Another one of the myths around that is that he also was said to establish the 3 great sciences of his time, which was astrology, alchemy, and also mystic psychology. Now, from those 3 sciences, you've got astronomy, chemistry, even medicine, which would have said came out of chemistry. So this is why Hermes Trismegistus is said to be the thrice great. So let's get back into the presentation where we will be starting off in the ancient era, specifically ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. So in ancient Egypt, there's very little we know about how they studied astrology prior to the 1500s. But what we do know is that they already had an established form and standardized form of astrology in the early ancient period alongside Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia is modern day Iraq, and it has been one of the founding places of Western astrology today. Back in the Mesopotamian period, they were practicing astrology as far back as 1500 BCE. I truly believe that it's a lot longer than that, but unfortunately, we haven't got the proof for that. And they focused on mundane astrology. So, mundane astrology is the astrology of nations, it's the astrology of the seasons and certain events that are going to happen. It's very simple statements. It's the recording of omens. It could be, an eclipse in a certain part of the sky would mean that the king would die, for example. Now, back in this time, astrologers were state funded. What this means is that all of the astrologers in Mesopotamia at the time were being paid to record these omens and actually send them back to whoever was the king at the time. And it was quite interesting because if they had a statement like the king was going to die on a specific day, they may even have done things like put in a temporary king for a day or a period so that they won't be the king that actually died at the time. So it was very important and an integral part of how they actually was living their lives and their day-to-day existence. Now, by the 1800s BCE, so this is before Christ, astrology in Mesopotamia was extremely popular. Everybody, it's like the normal trend, of the area, like a bit like don't know, Love Island today. It was just a part of life for people. And this continued, and the government as well, and this continued up until the Persian Empire conquered Mesopotamia in 500 BCE. Now we'll talk about those changes in just a bit. So when the Persian Empire actually occupied Mesopotamia, it created a shift in how astrology was practiced in that era. It went from being state funded to just being, well, if you want to practice it, you can, but there's no guarantee that you are going to get paid by anybody. And so this shift encouraged it going from mundane astrology, which is more for the nation, to natal astrology, which is all about the individual. And we actually have the oldest birth chart dating back to 410 BCE. Now, the birth charts that we would see then would be completely different than the birth charts we would see today, which would have aspects, asteroids. It will have all of the planets, including the outer planets as well. Back then, it would have been just the zodiac wheel, which was just established at the time, and where the planets were on that zodiac wheel. And so we move over to Egyptian astrology. So whilst you had Mesopotamian astrology, which was based on recording of omens, the state would have used it to avoid wars, famine, etc. On the other side, you had the Egyptians, which used a different astrological system than the Mesopotamians. They had a 36 decan system, and they used this system on a daily basis. So, looking at the diurnal rotation of the planet and separating the fixed stars as when it's rising and then when it's culminating, and what happens when certain stars are rising and where they are in the sky. Their new year would have been in Cancer because there is the star Regulus, and when it was on the horizon, and that's a fixed star, so that's not part of the diurnal rotation, the Nile would flood. So they marked that as their new year. Now, they used the deacon system for telling time and also for religious rituals as well. So it was a bit more like electoral astrology, although it wasn't. It was a mixture between mundane and electoral astrology, or like the father of them. And the deacons were in, and I cannot say this word, I've only ever read it, Salomocheskia. And these deacons actually became the precursor to the house system that we use today. So for those who don't know what the house system is that when you have a birth chart and it's been drawn up, if you have your time of birth, you will create something called your rising. Now, from that rising sign, the planet which was, or the sign which was rising on the horizon at the time of your birth, we then can draw out the house system. Now, there are many different house systems that are used by different astrologers and different cultures, depending on how they learn. But the house system is very important to understanding how each planet will manifest, or where in your life it will manifest its energy. And in the 4th century BCE, Alexandra the Great flew out of Greece and conquered first Egypt and then Mesopotamia. Now, here is just a quick or a small overview of his conquest. So as you can see, he goes down into Egypt, and then he goes all the way to Mesopotamia, but he actually goes all the way to the western hemispheres of India as well. And I think this is really a really important fact, that both Egypt and Mesopotamia, after that point, were speaking the same language. So there would have been exchanges, there would have been more trade, because there was a part of the same empire. And these were really the two major players in astrology in the Western world at the time, because the Indian tradition of astrology was still going strong at that time. It's never had a break. It's an integral part of their culture, whereas Western astrology has had its ups and downs, as you will see throughout this presentation. So this marked the beginning of the Hellenistic era of astrology. This is where we see that astrology really becomes the astrology that we practice in the West today. A lot has been added on top of it. There's different forms of astrology, but it really is just subsections to this original set of rules, principles that we used from which began in the Hellenistic period. So during the Hellenistic period, you found a fusion of the standardized zodiac system that you would have had in Mesopotamia, and then the decan system, which you had from Egypt, and they were actually intertwined, so that you would find every 10 degrees of a given sign would have a different decan, and this system is still alive today. Now, another very notable thing that happened was the founding of the Royal Library or the Library of Alexandria, which happened in 283 BCE by Ptolemy, who wrote the Tetrabiblos, which is a very key text in astrology, even till today. And in about the 100 BCEs, you saw the emergence of Hellenistic astrology, and it was a fourfold system of astrology that was established. So I'm just going to quickly go to the core of that system. So as I said, it was a fourfold system of astrology that was established. And so you had the planets, their significations, whether they were benefic or malefic, their gender, and their sect was also established in this time. And the majority of that is still relevant and still used till this day. We also had the signs of zodiac became standardized in the Hellenistic period, and their domiciles, their triplicities, their rulerships, the elements, gender, modalities, and their mutual receptions as well were all established during that time. Again, you had the houses were standardized during this time, and also the aspects that were standardized during this time. And any astrologer will tell you that these four things are core to their practice, whether they're doing mundane astrology, financial astrology. These are still the same four-part system that they would use this day. It's just how they apply it will change. There we go. So during this time, there was a synthesis and partly new invention going on throughout astrology. And some of the core concepts that were introduced during this time, and I'm sure that philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, all of these other beings during this time would have had their say in this. For example, the elements was something that Plato really established during that time because he had that conversation with his teacher and his predecessor as well. But the core concepts introduced at this time was the Female Mundi, which is the sign of the or the birth chart of the cosmos, or almost, and it was used as a teaching tool at the time to teach aspects, rulership system, etc. You had the rulership scheme as well. So if you don't know, each sign has a planet that rules them. For example, Aries is ruled by Mars. That rulership system was established during the Hellenistic period, and it stayed mostly the same until this day. You had the planetary joy scheme as well. The planetary joy scheme speaks of certain planets being very happy in certain houses in your birth chart. An example of that is that Mercury has its joy in the first house, whereas the sun has its joy in the ninth house. And then you also have the elements of the zodiac added in as well. And I truly believe that we must have had some input from people like Plato during that time to help that move along. So just going to quickly break down the Female Mundi for you. So I've put out a nice diagram of it. So what I really love about the Female Mundi is that the ascendant or the first house, which represents the character and the body of whatever it is that is being created, is actually in Cancer. Cancer is a female water sign ruled by the moon. So it means that in those days, the divine feminine was respected in this philosophy as it began almost, like it says, out of the darkness. You know, in the beginning there was darkness and God said, let there be light. That darkness, the ascendant is Cancer. The moon was also in the first house as well. And that's why the moon rules Cancer. And then you have the sign of Leo, again, a fixed fire sign, self-expression, a hot, fiery, determined, creative sign. And you've got the sun there, about sustaining its creative ability. And the sun then rules the second. So how it worked is that when they was actually working this out, because the high point is summer, they said the sun or the luminaries, which is both the sun and the moon, is going to rule those houses. The moon was assigned to Cancer, and then the sun was assigned to Leo, and then the other planets pan out around them on one side, and then that system is then reversed and going back over. So the next planet is Mercury. Mercury is in Virgo. Mercury can only ever go 28 degrees from the sun before it starts to go retrograde. That's because from where we are, looking towards the sun, Mercury is actually in between that. So it will never be able, from our view, to go too far away. And then you have Venus, which can only ever go 2 signs or 48 degrees from the sun, was assigned to Libra. And then next, you have Mars, which was assigned to Scorpio. You have Jupiter, which was assigned to Sagittarius. And then you have Saturn, which is the furthest planet that we can see by eye, which was then given Capricorn. And then this system was then just reversed. So you would then have Saturn again. So Saturn is almost like the antithesis to the luminaries, because Saturn is about structure, limitations, the physical world, discipline, and whereas the moon and the sun, they're about what I want and what I need. But again, they do work together in reality to create this synthesis, which enables us to manifest in the physical realm. But then we have Jupiter, again, which would have been assigned to Pisces. Saturn would have been assigned to Aquarius. Mars is assigned to Aries. You have you have Venus assigned to Taurus, and then you have Mercury, which is assigned to Gemini. And that's how we have the rulership system that we are still using till this day, bar the new planets, if you study modern astrology. You also have the aspects came from here as well, but that will be in one of my other classes where I'll be breaking down aspects. I also have another class where we'll be breaking down the houses in astrology as well, and the signs and the planets as well. This one. So in 2000 CE was the high point of Hellenistic astrology in the West. During this time, the Roman Empire became the primary superpower. But at this time, astrology really was just the thing. It was a part of most conversations. There was the conversation of whether it is a causal factor or whether it's just a sign. What they meant by that is causal means, does the planets have a direct influence over us, which people like Ptolemy says, yes, it has a direct influence over us, or is it just a sign as well? Now, during this time, they would have been having conversations with Christian philosophers as well, and that would have made a lot of there was a lot of interesting conversations going on at the time, especially because astrology came from the premise that life is fated to a certain extent, and that, just like Stoicism, which was big at that time, it's that what's going to happen to us is going to happen to us. We can only learn how to manage it better. And during this time, you also have that the Hellenistic astrology is transmitted into India. Again, as I said, that connection was there, but it would have taken a lot longer just because of the distance. But then it merged in Indian astrology with their lunar calendar, because they've got a 27 lunar calendar called the Noksatras, and astrology merged with that system as well, and they still use that till today. And there is a lot of Indian astrologers that reference or still use the techniques from 2000 years ago. And then in 300 CE, is transmitted into Persia. So Persians, unfortunately, a lot of their documents were destroyed, so we haven't got much information on the sort of astrology that they was practicing at the time. But what we do know is that they was using mundane astrology, and they were looking at Saturn Jupiter conjunctions. For example, they every 100, I believe it's 120 years, Saturn and Jupiter, when they go conjunct, they will be in one triplicity or one element. And we've actually lived through one of those shifts, because the last Jupiter Saturn conjunction was actually in 2020. Now, granted, it also had Pluto involved with that one as well, so it was just major. But you can see that those shifts and those conjunctions, they really mean a lot to us in society, and there is usually major change that happens whenever Saturn and Jupiter or Saturn and Pluto get involved in the mix. But unfortunately, trying to keep this an hour, I haven't got too much time to go into that, but it's actually very interesting. It's a very interesting study. And then we move over to the end of the Hellenistic tradition. So Hellenistic astrology really dies out by about the 7th century. This is because you had the fall of the Roman Empire, and so astrology is no longer really being practiced. And during that time, you also had the debates, as I was talking about earlier, and the battle with Christianity at that time. Again, Christianity was coming with that argument of, free will. If you choose to accept Jesus Christ into your life, then you no longer are bound by your birth chart. Whereas the astrologers were saying, no, the your life is fated. You can predict things about the future. And how can you predict things if then fate is not real? And there was the invention of a lot of magic during that time as well. So asking the ruler of your chart to, release you from fate, and all of this other really wonderful and amazing things were going on during that time, for people to better understand and connect to spirituality. And during that time, Egypt also fell to the Arab armies as well. So you had that the Roman Empire has fallen, then the Arabs have then taken back over Egypt, and there's a real decline in astrology in general after this period. So this is just a quick or a small image of the Islamic Empire, which, as you can see, goes down to the bottom of Spain, all of northern Africa, pretty much. And then you've got Mesopotamia, or the Middle East as well, was all a part of that empire by the 1750s. And this ushers in the medieval era. So during this time, there was an explosion of science and philosophy. And eventually, astrology was used again, but it was never at what it was used at the height, of the Hellenistic period. It was still very much science during that time, but there was certain rulers of the empire that still believes in astrology, and actually Baghdad was actually founded by astrologers. So they went to Abu Bashar and a group of other astrologers as well, and they asked them to basically find the right date for them to establish their new capital of the empire, which was Baghdad at the time. And I've actually got a chart of Baghdad, so you can actually see this is the the chart for Baghdad. And if you look at certain characteristics, you've got Jupiter, which is about expansion, it's the greater benefic, it's in the first house with the ascendant. And you also see that the sun is also in its joy of the ninth house as well, and it's trining off against Jupiter as well. So it prospered. It was a place of trade, and it really I believe after that point, you see an increased interest in astrology. And translation projects were also going on in this time because they took over Mesopotamia and they took over Egypt, and of course the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but there was loads of books that survived that fire that was supposedly a mistake. And so they started to translate all of this over into Arabic, and that increased the interest in astrology throughout the era as well. And then you had a fusion of the previous techniques again. So every couple hundred years we have this. We're actually due to have another fusion again, which I think is happening through the Hellenistic astrology and modern astrology. But they was fusing it together and coming up with their own astrology during this time. During this time, you would see different types of astrology. I believe Harari astrology became very popular during this time as well. Aurora astrology, if I'm saying that correctly, is when someone comes to you with a question, and based on the time and the place where they ask that question, you will then see whether they whether that question is a yes, a no. If it's about is something going to happen, you say yes, it's going to happen, or no, it's not going to happen. That was that. And that really set in the fourth branch of astrology. And there is no other forms of astrology to date. There's subsections from one of these four. And also during this time, the aspects doctrine, so aspects became there was a lot of different aspects that were needed for Harari astrology to work. For example, transfer of light and other techniques. So the general aspects doctrine just exploded at their time as well. And there was an elaboration of the Persian mundane doctrine as well due to this as well. So you have like semi-sextiles and all of this other stuff. I'm quite classic in how I do things, but I do know there's a lot of astrologers that like using all of the different aspects as well. So by this time, you have the four traditional branches of astrology. And to, like, as I was saying before, all other forms of astrology really came from one of these four branches. So you have mundane astrology. Again, this is really for the nation, is to indicate if there's going to be famine, something's going to happen to the king, something's going to happen to the economy. You have natal astrology, which is about a personal birth chart and how your life is going to pan out based on that birth chart. You have electional astrology as well, which is all about when should I do something. So it can go from the big things, so establishing Baghdad, which I've shown before in the presentation, or it can go to when do I get married. And then you have Harari astrology, which is all based on questions. And when someone comes to you with a question, the answer will come from the chart itself. So then we move over to the late medieval period of astrology. So Spain was under the rule of the Muslims from about the 8th century, but in the 12th century, you have the rebellion of Europe. I love the way they put it, Reconquista, so they're reconquering what was theirs. But it really was a rebellion. They've had enough of the rule and they start to push down. You have all of the other, the European nations, they start to push down at that time. They conquer back Spain as well. And as that starts to happen, you find a lot of astrologers start to flock to these different areas to start translating all of these texts that are in Arabic. Because by this time, the Arab nations had Egypt, they had Mesopotamia, they had up until India. So there was so much knowledge that was lost. So you had these, just hundreds of thousands of different scholars would have came and said, I want to translate these different texts. And as these texts were being translated, of course, you had the astrological texts were being translated as well. And this led to the revival of astrology happening. Astrology starts to get studied in major universities. So would have a chair of astrology in the universities during this time. And this is when you really see the rise of medical astrology as well. So it's talking about the temperaments within astrology. As I'm not a doctor, I do not touch medical astrology, as I feel like you do need a medical background to really be able to get the most out of medical astrology. And so this brings about the Renaissance period of astrology. Now, the key thing that happens here is that the printing press is invented in 1440. So before this time, everything was handwritten. So if you wanted something translated, people needed to come and they needed to write it out by hand. And this was extremely time draining, energy draining. You'd have scribes with lights on, you have to come back and say, are you finished? And it was just very hard to translate text as quickly as they needed to, and also to then publish those texts as well became extremely, it was just it was an extremely hard manual task up until this point. So after the printing press, you had a massive growth in the amount of astrological texts that were available. And you had the 12th century Arabic texts, which from Abu Bashar, which, so you had the Picatrix as well. All of these deep, powerful texts really were being published during this time. And during the Renaissance period, you did have the fall of Constantinople as well. And after that, you found a massive transfer of Greek over to European languages as well. That's typically Latin, is what they were using at the time. And as there was also a rise in the interest in looking at the classics as well, specifically to astrology, you would have had Platonism, and you would have had Hermeticism as well, which we did touch on briefly, which is a really core component to the philosophical basis of astrology. So again, this just spurred people up. And so by this time, we've got traditional astrology has fully been created, and it starts to decline again. As I said, astrology in the West, unfortunately, was never steady. Unlike the Indian tradition, which has kept up with astrology for the last 4,000 years. So this really was around the 17th century, really was the last time when astrology prospered in the West, where it was a really big accepted thing. And during this time, you had, because of all of these other texts, you had people like Christian Lilly, who was able to really focus his studies. He was primarily interested in horary astrology, and he wrote a book called Christian Astrology. It's a three-part book, really good book, really deep as well. And it really was the first text that was produced in English as well. So before that time, all astrological texts were in Greek, Arabic, or Latin. He broke the mold. And after that point, you saw that a lot of other astrologers started to write their texts in English as well. So it became more accessible to English people. Now, this is actually really important because if this didn't happen, astrology really could have died a terrible death in in Europe after this time. So after this time, you actually have the recession of astrology because there was a lot of social and religious changes at the time, and also Ptolemy's cosmology was actually disproven. Perfect. I can definitely send you a link to some of these books as well. I'll drop it in an email. Thank you. So because Ptolemy was born in a time and they thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and a lot of his justification for how astrology worked was based on that cosmology. When it was disproven, it was almost like astrology was disproven. Or although astrology was never disproven, it was just the argument that that he used that held its own against the Christians at the time in like um the early part of the millennia. It was disproven. So people are like, well, if it's not right, the whole thing isn't right. Because Ptolemy's argument was that astrology is a valid phenomenon because it's just a part of nature, just like gravity or studying trees. That's how he saw it. But because his basis was based on, or his thesis was based on the Earth being the center of the universe, I guess they just shredded him after that moment. Said astrology is not a valid phenomenon at all. And so it was removed from universities. It was no longer seen as a valid phenomenon during this time. And that really continued up until the 19th century. Now, there was some astrology that was kept over, but it was in the form of an almanac. So an almanac is almost like mundane astrology for the year. So you can buy an almanac saying what's going to be happening over the next year, and it will just tell you. It's very low level astrology, no high technical things like working with someone's birth chart. It's more just this is what's going on for that. And this is why I said that it was such a important Christian astrology was such an important text because it was the first text written in English, and that's what the normal person would have read. So if no one had ever written it in English, you may have seen almanacs die as well because almanacs were really just read by the normal people like that was into astrology like it was a newspaper for the year or maybe even for the month because in those days it would have had monthly ones as well. So got to thank William Lilly for that as well. And so after this, we're actually moving more into the modern era of astrology. So you have the rebirth or the revival of astrology when spiritualism and theology actually start to grow in Europe again. So it becomes normal to talk about ghosts, different types of religions, spirituality, and this really is what evolved into the quote unquote new age moment or era that we're in right now. So, like the whole hippie movement, all of this stuff, it really came from this revival of, well, maybe I would call it an awakening of spirituality in the Western world. And so public interest in astrology increased during this time as well. The normal person, because if you're talking about spirituality and karma and all of these other things, the planets are going to come into that conversation. Now, I generally believe it's because as technology grew, trade with England and places like India would have increased. So there would have been that cross-cultural exchanges. And so British people, which would have been traveled to India, maybe had business partners in places like India and other parts of the world, would have had their eyes open to a different type of life. And of course, astrology would have been a part of that conversation, because wherever you find deep spiritual people, you find them looking at the stars. Now, Alan Leo is really credited with the revival of astrology as well, because he really wanted to simplify how we look at astrology, simplify those systems, and he focused it less on predictive astrology and more on the astrology of personality, which is okay, if you are a Virgo, then you like to pay attention to detail. If you are a Leo, then you are an expressive, confident, regal character. So this really led on to the modern era of astrology, which focused very heavily on sun sign astrology. Now, sun sign astrology, there's nothing wrong with sun sign astrology, but it really is a major step away from the ancient Hellenistic astrology, or the core of astrology. Reason being is that they focused on the sun sign. So it would be, you're born between the 19th of January and the 19th of February, great. Then you're on Aquarius. Now, this isn't very personal because there's 30 days, whereas before they would have focused on your rising sign, because your rising sign is based on the time of day you were born, not just the date. So you can be an Aquarius, but you can have a Sagittarius rising, you can have a Scorpio rising, you can have a Taurus rising, and you'll all be born on the same day. And then you had Rudyard, who integrates psychology and astrology. And he used Carl Jung's model of psychology, and his book was The Astrology of Personality. And he really was the person who created what is called Jungian astrology, which really focuses on using astrology to better understand and work with yourself. And I believe that was what created the spur into evolutionary astrology as well, although evolutionary astrology is a lot more modern as well. Now, astrology at this time took away its focus from external events in the West. It was almost like predictive astrology was almost looked down upon. You shouldn't be trying to predict the future. No, astrology is based purely on your personality. I know this because I got into that myself as well. But really, why this makes sense is that a lot of the techniques from the ancient periods were lost by this time. They wasn't transferred. It was a time more of innovation, observing different things, creating new things, rather than passing on that tradition as well. Now, during this time, you also had the full incorporation of the outer planets into astrology. So much so that they actually replaced some of the rulers of the signs with some of the outer planets. So Neptune was assigned to Pisces, you had Uranus was assigned to Aquarius, and you had Pluto, which was assigned to Scorpio. Now, during this period, you also had a fusion almost of the signs and the houses in astrology. What I mean by that is the first house of astrology was then associated with Aries. Now, from my own observations, I feel that this particular way of looking at it, it doesn't work well with all of the houses. And this is, I feel like there was more of a focus on innovation than understanding why the techniques worked in the first place. All the techniques were just not revealed again. They need to be retranslated, which did happen because there's now been a revival of traditional astrology as well, which happened quite recently. So during the 1960s, you had a very massive, I think it's around the hippie movement, you had a massive influx of astrologers. Now, it's very interesting because during this time, you also had a sextile between Uranus and Neptune. So almost everybody you know will have this sextile. It was moving in and out of range for something about 90 years, where you had, because they're such slow moving planets, when they create a major aspect, it lasts for a very long time, especially because their speeds are so close to each other as well, so it takes some time for them to separate. And so it doesn't make sense that they was looking into the laws of the universe and connecting to spirituality, the dream world, doing things differently. You had the rise of like drugs, LSD, etc. around this time as well. But then you also had the invention of computers and the internet, which changed the game completely for astrology. Never before could you practice astrology without knowing the mathematics. That is a major game changer. Before that time, for you to work out a birth chart, you couldn't just type it into a screen. You had to have an ephemeris. So an ephemeris is almost like a calendar. So it will go back in dates. You can get ephemerises for thousands of years. You can get ephemeris for 50 years. And it will just tell you where the planets were at that time. Now, after you got the ephemeris, you would then need to use the mathematics to work out all of the aspects of that chart as well. So being an astrologer, if you go back 25 years ago, it was a hard profession to be in, a rewarding one, but it's a hard profession to be in, because if someone gave you a date, there was research and mathematics. But the rise of computers and the internet made it possible, firstly, with just computers, to have systems where you could put in someone's birthday and the program itself would already have an ephemeris, which was pre-programmed into the software. And so it would bring up everything that you needed. And then with the invention of the internet, you didn't even need a program to do it. There were sites where you could not just only get your reading and your birth chart, you actually could get an interpretation of that as well. And so that really just changed the game for astrologers. Also, the amount of information which was available to astrologers as well. All of the different books that you could just have access to, you could buy, means that the amount of astrology that was being practiced, more likely never seen before this time. I do believe that the backlash of that, though, is that there's maybe too much information that hasn't been organized, so there's not enough awarding bodies, I would say, or regulatory bodies to even look at how people practice astrology. It's more everybody just puts things together, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But there is a beauty in the innovation, but there is also that importance to study the traditional side of astrology as well, just so that we don't get too far away from the core of what it is that we're trying to do, which is to better navigate life and the universe, although the ancients would have called that fate. And then we move over to the revival of astrology. So again, before the 20th century, there wasn't many astrological texts that survived. It could have just been because of the decline of astrology. People didn't keep up with the books, and so they just get destroyed, lost in different like gardens. I remember there was some of the text from, I believe it was Ptolemy's text, was found in a random attic in like Germany. So there was just so much missing information that was needed to be translated. Now, the issue with that was that people needed specialized skills to even read the text. So although we could have had the text, if you had an ancient Greek text, if no one knew how to read ancient Greek, it just sits there. And so there needed to be a change in the interest of studying the classics again, which happened in the 1980s to the 1990s as well, where people started to look into the classics, so people went out and actually learned how to speak Greek. These amazing astrologers that have gone out and they've learned how to speak ancient Greek, Latin, and they've just started to translate these different texts. And this was a major one, was done started in 1992. It's called Project Hindsight. The reason why I'm referencing Project Hindsight specifically is that the revival of Hellenistic astrology came primarily from this project. And Hellenistic astrology, as I explained at the beginning, really is where the foundation of what astrology was created. The creation of the 12 houses, the standardizing of the zodiac, the aspects doctrine, the planetary rulership doctrine as well was all there. The invention of the Fema Mundi as well was all in there. So one of the big forms of astrology that was being revived was actually Horary astrology. Interestingly enough, I believe this was because Christian astrology became a very popular book. And in Christian astrology, in book 2, he doesn't go into natal astrology, he actually goes straight into Horary astrology. So it seemed that was his main type of astrology, was people coming to him and asking him questions, and based on the time that they asked him that question, he would tell them whether it's going to happen or not. And then in 1982 you had a paper on whole sign houses being published. Now this is big because whole sign houses is a form of house division that allows us to really work with perfection years in someone's chart as well. And what a perfection year is, every year there is a different part of your chart which is activated, or the promise of that is activated. Then looking at that, we can look at what transits are important to that individual. Because when you look at a birth chart, there's so much in it. It's like, well, what is all of this happening all the time? And the the easy answer is, well, no, it's not always happening all the time. These are promises within the chart, but they activate at different times. And we all know that years can be different. You know, we could have themes for years. We could, so there's just like, you look back, you're like, whoa, that year was really all about my money, for example, or that there was just a lot of family stuff that came up that year. And that usually is because a different house has been activated. And then the transits then are almost pushing us to grow inside of that particular area of our lives. And then after this, we have the Council of the Vedic. A Vedic Astrology Council is established in America as well. And at this time, it means that they became warding bodies and also people that were regulating and allowing people to study astrology being open in America, which then allowed it to spread. And with Vedic astrology, because of its link with Hellenistic and very traditional astrology as well, the Hellenistic period was almost reawoken in the modern times when people went back into looking at the text of Ptolemy and reading things like the Tetrabiblios and looking at how we can work with these omens that are happening in the sky to live a better life. And of course, now we all know that there's many different translations that are available. So firstly, I just want to thank everybody for listening in for the hour. If there's any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. So for those who weren't at the beginning, as you know, my name is Darrell Whitaker, and these are some of the services that I provide. So I do basic readings. Which type of astrology do I lean towards? That's a very good question. I lean towards, currently, I'm very invested in Hellenistic astrology, as I believe it gives the structure in which the rest of the techniques that we're using works. My aim is to be able to fuse Hellenistic astrology with evolutionary astrology at a certain point, because then you will have the structure from a place of it's fated, so I have to look really deeply in what's happening and understand that, and then you will mix in my life is mine to control and for me to evolve in it. So then I believe those two mixed together, I believe that's going to be the next form of astrology that will live on for the next 100, 200 years. I hope that's answered your question. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, yeah, so we have the basic reading. A basic reading is just me going over the planets, the recurring themes, and the general promise of the chart. It's best for someone who doesn't want a full, in-depth reading because they just don't know that much about astrology but they're interested in it. Then we have the full reading. So a full reading will take anything up to 2 hours, where we're going to go deep into the aspects, the perfection year, if there's any transits. Of course, we'll look at all of the planets and the houses, everything that you do in the full reading as well. And then we also have the year ahead reading as well, which is where we look at the transits and then your perfection year, and we say, okay, what transits are really going to be important for you to look out for during the rest of the year. So I just want to say thank you as well for joining and for watching as well. Is there any other questions? No? Okay, perfect. So if you do want to follow me at all, I've just put in my handles. So I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, but my main platform I would say is Instagram. You can either put this in to your web browser, or you can just put in Darryl_Whitaker and I will come up as well. So again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great evening. You will get an email with a link to the recording of this presentation as well, so you're able to watch it back. And last but not least, you are perfect by design. I hope you have a great evening.